Hello, my name's Lucy Rycroft-Smith, and today I'm bringing you a session for this Culturally Responsive Communities Conference focused on LGBTQ plus identities and schools. As you can see, my Twitter handle is @honeypiesquared and you can follow me there. And I'm also a PhD student at the University of Cambridge, where I'm researching knowledge brokering, which is all to do with how teachers access research and how research gets used to make decisions. So, here's a little about me and a rather lovely photo of me. You can see that I used to be a teacher and a lecturer, and my subject specialism is mathematics. But actually I've taught many subjects in my time, and here you can see a copy of my book, which I also have here, called The Equal Classroom. And this is a book about gender, sexuality, identity, which I wrote with Graham Andre, who you may remember was the subject of a BBC documentary in which he very bravely allowed cameras into the classroom, into his classroom, and they really took a look at what it was like to consider the types of things that teachers said and did on a daily basis, the kind of micro decisions that were made, and the effect that that might have on children and gender stereotypes, identities, role modelling, lots of different ideas. And so Graham was very kind enough to co-write this book with me. And we did a lot of thinking about a lot of different topics, which I'll talk about in a second. So I'm also a parent, which is very important, and it's particularly important to me because I'm raising children, some of whom have done a lot of questioning about their gender identity and who are teenagers, and lots of the ideas in this talk I have dealt with from the other side of the table as a parent, as well as a teacher, and that's particularly important. As I said, I'm a researcher, I'm a writer. I'm queer, and to me that word's very useful because it means a lot of things to me. It means that I am somebody who isn't heterosexual, isn't cis-normative, has done some identity work around who I am in regards to the way that I relate to the world. So this isn't for me about what's in my pants or what's in other people's pants, who I'm sexually attracted to, although you could be forgiven for understanding it in that way. Actually, it's about blurring boundaries, understanding marginalised communities, and feeling safe and wanting other people to feel safe around me in particular spaces, and I'll talk a little bit to that later on. And then you can also see there that I do lots of work and research around the research practice space, and what I call the academic space. So being very understanding of the idea that research is important, but it also has limited uses, and research can be used to make decisions, but it's not the only thing that we use to make decisions. That's really important. Okay. I think it's also really important when we're talking about identity to consider the idea that we bring our whole selves to the table, and part of queerness for me again is that boundary blurring. I'm a professional, I'm a mathematician, I'm a researcher. Some of those things people consider to be very serious and also perhaps incompatible for them with other types of identity that I bring, femininity or artistic and creative identities. And for me, it's really important to challenge those boundaries. I grew up as a young person being told quite often that it was not okay for me to want to be artistic and creative, but also a mathematician or a scientist. That I had to pick, that I had to choose one of those things. That was a boundary that I was given as a child that I resisted. And you can see now how that relates to queerness, the idea that actually I wanted to resist that binary in some way. I wanted to say, hang on, what if this isn't a this or this situation, but maybe it's an and situation? And you can see here a little bit of my work, perhaps blurring the boundary between mathematics and art. For example, I'm a mathematical artist. And this is an idea that I take into my research work quite a lot, the idea of queering boundaries, taking ideas where we might have traditionally thought it's A or B and saying, what happens if there's an intersection and overlap? What happens if there's an A and B? And that's particularly important, this idea of queerness, in my research work as well as my personal identity. So when thinking about LGBTQ plus identities, a general overview of the research tells us a few things. It's particularly important to recognise complexity. And by that I mean there's no straightforward simple answers here. We can definitely have some distilled ideas that we can take forward in education. And I'm not saying there's nothing that we can do. I'm not saying there aren't any important takeaways, but it's very important to understand this is a complex area. And in particular, questions of identity and self with intersectionalities always are complex. And what I mean by intersectionality here is that when we have questions of identity, it's very important that we don't split off those questions of identity and only consider very particular questions of identity on their own without considering the self as a whole. So for example, when you see me presented before you today, you're making some decisions about how I present and what that might mean. You might have made some decisions that I look female, that I'm presenting as a female to you, also that I'm white, also that potentially there's lots of other parts of my identity that you're making decisions about, and all of those things combine in an intersectional way to give you some clues about my identity and who I am. And those are really, really important in the way that they combine. And as a mathematician, I often think that drawing on the work of Kimberly Crenshaw, the idea that they're intersectional means potentially they may multiply rather than add. And what that means potentially is that privilege might be multiplicative, but also discrimination and bias might be multiplicative. And so if we've got students in our classrooms and in our schools who are marginalised, who have historically marginalised identities, then we have to be particularly careful to think about their identities as a whole. And in practice, what that means is if we have students who might have identities that are marginalised for one reason, for two reasons, for three or four reasons, they are particularly at-risk students. We need to be especially careful to take care of those students. That's something I'll return to. A really, really big takeaway here in terms of synthesising the research is we should ask members of the LGBTQ plus community for their experiences, for their thoughts and their advice. And this is an area where I have done this in this presentation. I continue to do this. I'm not an expert on the experiences of everybody who's LGBTQ plus or everybody who's queer. In particular, I note that my experience of being a queer person really doesn't cover being trans, for example. I'm not a trans person. I haven't had those experiences, and it's really, really important that we continue to listen to members of the community whom we're researching about and with. It's absolutely the number one thing we should do before we even begin. There's a lot of assumptions I think people bring to this area, and it's really important to highlight and question those, which I'll do a little bit today. The diversity is really important here. I think it's a really interesting question to consider what people first think of when they think of LGBTQ as a label. And quite often students will say to me, oh, that means pride, that means going to pride, it means being very flamboyant, very colourful, it means you wear sequins, don't you, miss, or, you know, whatever it is. And I think there's such a diversity of experience underneath that umbrella. We need to be very, very careful not to think that LGBTQ plus is about homogenising people and about trying to actually fit people into categories of what's acceptable and what isn't. And queerness, again, in some sense is about resisting those labels and those categories. Reading, researching, placing your own self and your own experiences in context. And this is particularly important if you're a teacher, if you're an educator who has lived your life really largely free of this identity work. If you haven't come across these issues and really had to struggle or grapple with them, I have a lot of sympathy for your position. Of course, nobody's saying you should have to, but if you haven't ever dealt with these issues in some detail, then it is really, really important to try and have some empathy with people who may have done, and try and do some of that work, even a little bit, in order to try and understand the journey that it takes having to be confronted with these issues every day. Because actually, gender might be an open door for you that you're just walking through every day. You know, sexuality, it might be something you've never noticed. And for some people it's closed. You know, they're having to deal with day to day other people's expectations, other people's discomfort levels, and it's something that perhaps you don't have to. And that really requires a degree of empathy and deep thought and maybe some work. Recognising that we're all learning. These are sensitive, emotive issues. You know, I do lots of research in different areas, and this is a particular area where it's different. You know, it feels quantitatively different. And why is that? And qualitatively too, right? And that's because this is about people's real lives. It's about their identities. This isn't the same as maths education research for me because it goes deep and it's about who people are. And so it's very important to recognise that. And then finally, thinking about prompting dialogue and conversation, which is what I hope to do today, and connecting with projects and organisations already working in this area. There are people doing brilliant work. We don't have to start from scratch the whole time. We don't have to go on our journey alone. So here are some of the chapter headings and some of the ideas that are dealt with in the book. And we also had a few experts contribute to this book, and they did a great job. And something that I wanted to highlight here is that we wrote this book thinking that this would be a kind of useful collection of some of the issues that were really pertinent to today's educators. But really, as Graham and I were thinking about these issues, and as some of the contributors were writing about these issues, as we were doing the research for the book and really starting to sit down and think in detail, it struck me again that these are not new issues. All of the issues listed here in relation to gender and sexuality, in particular to do with education, but also to do with society, culture, who we are in the world and how we navigate and find our place as humans, as individuals. These are issues that have been around for as long as humans have been around. And I think sometimes we forget that. And I think there is a tendency as we politicise gender and sexuality to say, oh, why are you bringing these new ridiculous issues to the fore now? Things were fine as they were. Everything was fine when men were men and women were women. And we had these good traditional gender roles. Everybody was happy. You know, why are you causing a fuss? And I think what's interesting is to really think about, if you look at throughout history, queer people, queer thoughts, queer ideas have always been here. Sometimes they've been silenced. Sometimes history's been rewritten in order to silence these thoughts, these people. And it really doesn't take a lot of scrutiny to notice queerness throughout history. So, for example, many people will tell you that they are absolutely huge fans of David Bowie. David Bowie there, very well known for playing with gender stereotypes in a variety of different ways. We've also got people dressing in different ways, and you can see today that I'm dressed in what might be called menswear. And this is Twiggy from the 60s, for example, again playing with boundaries of clothing, different gendered clothing. This is James Baldwin, who is one of my heroes, a wonderful writer, civil rights activist, queer hero. Again, thinking about some of the ways in which he wrote and thought and fought. These ideas have been around for a long time. This was from an exhibition at the Smithsonian where it was focused on queer relationships throughout history. You would be surprised at some of the photographs and how far back they go. This photograph was just captioned Davis and JC 1951. You may recognise this. This is Alan Turing, again one of my heroes. An extremely sad story, but somebody to look into, again, if you're thinking about issues surrounding gender and sexuality and thinking about how somebody could be vilified and ultimately tortured for their sexuality, even though ultimately they were a national hero. You may recognise this person. This is Marlene Dietrich, again somebody who played with gender boundaries, was openly queer in their personal life. This is Florence Nightingale, a mathematician, statistician. There have been many open questions about Florence's relationships with women. She's written quite a lot about that in her letters. There's a lot of queerness to Florence's life and writings, and it's a very interesting question to decide really how one places the idea of contemporary queerness on figures from the past. You may recognise this person. This is Louis XIV. Once again, thinking about how we present, how we dress. Louis XIV was well known for being a flamboyant dresser, and in particular wearing high heels, which were known as les talons rouges. And you'll see there started a huge fashion for them. And again, presented in a way that, again, we may forget these days, was seen as, this was seen as very masculine. This was seen as the height of being masculine. Things change, mores change, social cultures and norms change. This is Leonardo da Vinci, who was also very well known for having relationships that were not heterosexual, in many ways queering boundaries between art, mathematics, engineering, creativity. And this is Alexander the Great again. Lots of writing about him and his relationships with the world and with other people being queer. So just a little bit of history there. Queer people have been here for a long time and will continue to be here, in terms of great scholars, great thinkers, great relationships with other people, and the way that the world has changed because of queer people has been rewritten in ways that I think we're only starting to understand now. So something to think about from research is this idea of gender and what it is. I'll give you a second just to think about that, because quite often when I talk about the ways that gender's been defined to people, they struggle a little. We've often grown up with the idea that gender or sex maybe is the same thing. It's made clear to us when we're young that we put people in these categories. There are two categories and it's very easy. We are given boys and girls, men and women, animals and things can also be put in these categories, and the world is straightforwardly categorised like this quite often when we're young. And people say, well, therefore we shouldn't break gender binaries because it confuses children. And yet at some point I think we begin to realise as we grow older, hang on a sec, there seems to be something else going on here, because gender actually isn't the same as sex. There's something going on where we're performing gender. Gender is something about masculinity and femininity that isn't quite the same. And when I talk to people about that, some people have really thought about this in a lot of detail and some really haven't, and that's okay wherever you're at with that. But thinking about the idea that masculinity is something you construct or femininity is something you construct, and there's actually also something in between that, which is a sort of gender neutrality or not conforming to gender ideas or gender binaries. That's really important to think about. There is definitely a space that exists in between or overlapping where you can be androgynous, you can not ascribe to either idea, and you can really deconstruct ideas of masculinity and femininity. That's really important. So that's the wordy part, but actually what most people connect with much more is this picture. So I'll give you just a moment to think about the ideas that come up for you, the memories maybe that come up for you when you see this picture. What thoughts do you have? How does it make you feel? And if you're somebody, again, who's grown up cisgendered or heteronormatively or heterosexual, you might feel that you fit quite nicely on one side of this picture, or you might not. You might reject this gender binary. You might feel you've had children and you didn't want them to grow up in this kind of gendered tradition of toys, and yet you didn't have much choice. And that's important too. How we often as parents feel we don't have much agency because the world intervenes, and that's been interesting for me as well. So think about your reaction here, and what it might feel like to be a child presented with this, and what that tells you about who you are in the world and who you might grow up to be. And this is still very prevalent. I think, most of us would agree. I think, there's lots of data about what's getting better and what's not, but this is a still very relevant picture about what boys and girls and people experience in their day-to-day life. So this is something I often talk to people about. This takes the idea of a gender binary and gives a little more subtlety, a little more nuance to it. If you've never considered the idea before that there is much more subtlety and nuance to sex and gender identity and gender expression and sexual orientation, then this might be helpful. So let's consider the idea of somebody who is born female. I was, for example, perhaps likes to express their gender identity as woman. That feels good, that feels okay. And they have this feminine expression, so they look feminine, they like to express themselves in their dress, perhaps in ways that feel feminine, and their sexual orientation is straight in the sense that they're attracted to men. So they have this alignment down here. And mostly as a society, we like that. It makes us feel good, it makes us feel comfortable. However, the issue for us then is when somebody doesn't fit that neat alignment on this graph. You know, what happens then? We have somebody who has a biological sex that's female, and then perhaps they reject that. Their gender identity is genderqueer. They don't like it. Or they actually feel like their gender identity is man. They want to be expressed as masculine. Or maybe they're bisexual, maybe they're asexual, meaning that they don't actually want to have sexual relationships with anyone. They just want companionship. They want maybe romantic, but not sexual relationships. We might start to feel uncomfortable. We don't know what to do with that. Who is this person wearing menswear? What are they? How do I deal with that? What do they like? Should I invite them to the hen night? You know, how do I connect with this person? And I think what's really interesting is that becomes about our discomfort as a person, really. And we often privilege our discomfort over theirs. And if you really try and empathise with that person, you know, they are in a situation where the body they have perhaps doesn't fit with how they feel inside. And that's an extreme amount of conflict to have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. It is all of your life, really, this idea that you are being gendered constantly, against your will often. And that's something to really think about. You know, if you are somebody for whom this is not a neat, gentle alignment that fits everybody's expectation on here, you are constantly having to deal with something that perhaps you don't want to, but you don't have a choice. You know, people are trying to fit you in these boxes constantly. And that's really something that our children are going to have to deal with if they are not neatly aligned on here. And so that's when we're talking about LGBTQ identities in education, that's what we're talking about. And the idea of experimentation and the fact that this isn't set in stone, this might be temporary. You might go through different parts of your life where you experiment with some of these things. You know, for those of us who, for example, are queer, I don't think we've always thought necessarily that we are the particular sexual orientation that we are now. For some people, it might be a different journey. And so it is absolutely fine to go through different periods of your life, particularly when you're younger, and have some sense of exploration with that identity, you know, just as you would with any other part of your identity. There is nothing to be worried about there at all. And, you know, I'm just going to briefly touch on here something that, you know, I think people worry about a lot, which is this idea that if you experiment with gender identity, gender expression, or sexual orientation, that then becomes sexual deviance and perversion. There's something there that I think we're not quite understanding. It is very normal for young people to experiment with their identity. You know, they go through a goth phase, they go through a My Little Pony phase. There's nothing wrong with that. But what we're saying here is this is slightly different. You know, it is not to say that every young person needs to go through a phase where they reject the gender that, you know, they are particularly expressing at that time, or they particularly go through a phase where they are all homosexual. That's not how it works. But equally, it is absolutely right that they question ideas of gender. They consider deeply ideas of gender. They do identity work, because that's very, very important about, you know, it's sort of an idea of becoming an adolescent, becoming an adult, that they should question lots of aspects of their identity. So I think in order to support them, we need to understand these ideas very deeply. We need to make sure that we understand the words, the vocabulary, give them support, but also to some degree allow them to do that work and step back and give them the space to become who they are. So I talked about going on your own journey, and this is really important. For some people, I suspect you haven't asked these questions of yourself. Others you may have. And so it's important to me to put these questions out here and to say, you know, if you're a teacher working with young people, it's really, really important to at least pose these questions to yourself, to think carefully about, have you done any of this identity work? And if not, maybe it's worth a little of your time just to think about, what journey have you been on with your own identity around gender and sexuality? This is not to say you should have this conversation with pupils, of course not, or even colleagues, but with yourself, certainly. So there's a few questions here that you might find useful to ask yourself, maybe to have a think about. If you have somebody at home that you feel you would like to have this discussion with, someone you trust, I think that would be a useful thing. There's certainly questions I've asked myself many times. And in particular, I think this last one, what does it mean to disrupt or resist conforming to gender identities? There's something, as I said, in this relationship to sexual deviance that people have made a connection over the years. And again, this is about discrediting queer people, specifically to quiet, to silence them. And if we turn that around and say, actually, what does it mean to disrupt or resist conforming to gender identities? And we say there's something there about non-conforming, to disrupt or resist actually can be a good thing. There's a creativity to that, to ask those questions. What if? What if the world wasn't organised on the basis of man and woman? And I say the world, this country. There are many cultures in the world that aren't organised on that basis, and different societies at different times haven't been organised on that basis. And these are good questions for young people to ask, and they're good critical questions, and they should be asking. So I'm just going to go through a little bit of vocab here, because as I said, I'm not going to assume that anybody knows anything. Very important. And these are the questions that I get asked the most. What do these words mean? These are not the definitive definitions. They are the definitions that I've taken from different parts of research. And if you have questions or you think you have better definitions, I would be very, very happy to hear them. So again, we have this idea of a differential between sex and gender. And it's really, really important to understand this, that people are born a certain biological sex, and sometimes they're born into sex. Quite a high proportion, really. And what that means in practice is that potentially some infants are born that sexually ambiguous in that case, right? So they could end up being biologically male or female. They're essentially both, and that's something to be aware of. Then we have this idea of gender, which is the social cultural category that you identify with. And usually that's woman or man. But as we said, some people are agender, some people are non-gender conforming, some people prefer to resist that binary. That's important and interesting to think about. And then we have this gender identity. So that's the identification of one's own gender. And the idea of choice and consent is really important here. So when we're saying things to people like, what is your gender? That's a really important question. Not what's your preferred gender, what is your gender? You feel your gender. So just take a second and think about what your gender is. And think about if somebody misgendered you. So, if you're male and you're a man, if somebody didn't say he to you, if they started saying she, how that might feel. And equally, if you're she and her, if somebody started saying he and him, and if you're somebody who uses they and them and you feel very strongly that you don't like the he and his or the she and her, again, how that might feel to be misgendered. And then think about somebody doing that to you all day long. And you might start to appreciate this idea of, if there's a discrepancy between your sex and your gender, what that might be like. Again, a similar idea if somebody just gave you the wrong name all day long, used the wrong name for you. Then we get into this idea of sexuality. So sexual orientation or preference. It's a really interesting question, whether this is permanent or temporary. I touched on this a little bit earlier. This idea of an enduring pattern, really interesting. Could be romantic, could be sexual. Usually both, not always. Again, we have people who are asexual. And then the idea of being cisgender or cis. So biological sex and gender aligning. So as we saw in the graph before, coming down in a straight line. And sometimes people use cishet, so being cisgender and heterosexual. A few more terms here. So we have lesbian and gay, so woman who's attracted to women and man who's attracted to men. Then we have bisexual, and this one's really interesting. I've had a few people question me on this one recently, because the ideas of bisexual and pansexual, often these definitions are a little contested. Bisexual, at the moment, I've got there attracted to both women and men, and pansexual, attracted to people of any sex or gender identity. And so by those definitions, I would probably identify as pansexual, but actually there's some interesting questions about how those terms are used. Sometimes people might say, for example, that bisexual where the gender of the person matters to you, and pansexual is where it doesn't. There's lots of different competing definitions, so interesting one. Then we have transgender or trans, so having a gender identity or expression that differs from sex assigned at birth. And very important here that you use transgender or trans to describe a person. That's an adjective, so somebody is a transgender person, that they are not a transgender. That's not polite. Then we have queer, and we've talked about that a little bit. I really prefer that term as an umbrella term, so not heterosexual, not cisgender, but also something there about the word queer for me means questioning. It means I question boundaries, and it also means you're safe with me if you also question boundaries. Then we also have the idea of questioning, and that's why we have that Q on the end. People who are unsure and exploring, concerned about using a label, which is also fine. Intersex, as we talked about before, sex characteristics that might not fit the typical definitions for male or female bodies. Asexual, which is often shortened to ACE, which is people who may not feel sexual attraction to others, may have low sexual interest or desire. Quite often you might have teenagers who hit puberty, might be very confused about not having those feelings, particularly in a world where really having sexual feelings is very widely talked about. It seems to be a bit of a rite of passage for teenagers. It's very strongly prevalent in media and advertising. It's very important that we talk to teenagers about this. And again, you'll see, you know, there's a very strong political agenda often to talk about LGBTQ ideas and queerness being strongly aligned with sexuality and deviance and perversion. Actually, quite often it's the very opposite. We're trying to make space for young people, for anybody to be who they are, and that quite often includes being not sexual at all. So somebody who identifies with being asexual or ace, they would like space in their life not to be a sexual being, and that's very important. Then we have non-binary or NB, and quite often that gets shortened, so you'll hear somebody say, I'm an NB. And that is somebody who has a gender identity that's outside the gender binary. They reject the gender. Then you have agender or genderless or gender free. So again, no gender or being without a gender identity. That's a lot of things. So I'm just going to talk you through some statistics now, and this is very, very important to be aware of. The idea here is that I've tried to get some relatively up-to-date statistics on what's going on in schools with LGBTQ students so that we can think about the best way to support those students. The headline here is that LGBTQ plus students are still being discriminated against and are still not safe. And you'll see here that this Stonewall report suggests that many of those students are being bullied, and many of them don't see themselves represented in their sex and relationships education. And those two, for me, are related, because those students are not being well represented, and feeling safe and feeling seen are very, very closely aligned. We also have students who are missing school because they are being bullied, and they are feeling that that's having a negative effect on their plans for future education. These are very, very serious issues. The culture in schools is still very homophobic, and that means we hear language and we hear all sorts of phrases around school, and I suspect you may too, that relate to derogatory terms for students who are LGBTQ. They are also exposed to lots of offensive content online. But the big headline here is that trans pupils are by far the most at-risk group. And we are absolutely failing our trans pupils at the moment. And if there's one thing you take from this talk today, it's that we have our students who are, at the moment, giving us, giving us one of maybe the most sacred things they can, which is that they're worried about their own gender identity, they're confiding in us, and quite often what we're doing as teachers is absolutely nothing. We're essentially throwing them to the wolves at this point. So 2 in 3 trans pupils being bullied, 1 in 10 death threats, and more than 2 in 5 have tried to take their own lives. That is the absolute takeaway from this session. We need to do better for our trans pupils. In terms of support, many of our pupils at school who are LGBTQ plus are saying there isn't an adult that they can talk to. Quite often this is because adults at school aren't out. And this is a minefield, because we are absolutely not saying that all adults at school who have these identities should be openly out. Sometimes it's not safe. Sometimes it doesn't feel good to be an adult who's out at school for a variety of reasons, and that is okay too. Nobody is saying that all adults who are queer at school should be out and open to talk about their identities. It would be wonderful if they felt that they could. But clearly, if students aren't able to see themselves represented in those identities with teachers, and they also don't feel they can go and see teachers who've had that experience or even are allies to that experience, there is an issue. And in particular, there's an issue with bi members of staff and trans members of staff being open and comfortable to talk to students. Really worrying here is we have many members of staff at schools not being familiar with the term trans and what it means. And therefore we have trans pupils, not surprisingly, not being able to be known by their name and not being able to use the toilets they feel comfortable in. This should not be controversial. If a pupil wants to change their name, we call them by their new name. If a pupil wants to use a different toilet, they use a different toilet. None of this should be controversial. We should be absolutely protecting trans students. They are the most at-risk students by far. All the research suggests that. As I said, this has a direct effect on attainment. So we have LGBTQ plus students being most bullied and victimised by their peers. This is intersectional with other identities. So if you have students who are LGBTQ plus who are also then black, who are also neuroatypical, for example, who are also disabled, you really need to take care. Those students are the most at-risk students. They are suffering high levels of attempted suicide, of mental health issues, and they are leaving school with comparatively lower levels of attainment. It's an absolute disgrace. There is no good reason for that at all. Part of the issue here is that the topics that are related to LGBTQ ideas, even just relationships that are same-sex, for example, absent from the curriculum. And when subject areas are trying to do that, they're not really doing it very well. That's because what we have in schools is this heteronormative and cisgendered culture, and staff are not questioning cultural norms. And what I mean by that is, if everything revolves around a mummy and a daddy and they fall in love and all of that is normalised and there is no room for anything else, it is not a surprise therefore that we have people who don't fit that feeling out of place, like they don't belong, and ultimately being bullied. So this also relates to other ideas of patriarchy. We've got teachers hearing sexist language in schools. They don't know how to deal with sexism. This is very intimately related. These are not separate issues. We've also got misogynistic language. So if you think about the idea that we've got pupils trying to reject the gender binary, resist ideas of gender binary, and yet we have a culture where people are being told that the worst thing you can do is be female and the best thing you can do is be male, and using this kind of language, you can see how all of these things combine to create this kind of microcosm of patriarchy in schools and just replicate what goes on elsewhere. We're not making any wholesale changes at this point. We're just continuing to perpetuate what's going on elsewhere. We are not challenging. Many pupils think that the sex and relationships education they received at school is poor or terrible. And most of them are not getting any sex and relationships education which refers to LGBTQ people at all. Once again, this is related to patriarchy and sexism and misogyny. They are all intimately related. So here's an example from my subject, which is mathematics. And this is a question to ask ourselves. How might we be contributing not just with our teaching and our attitude and our policies, but our resources? What might our resources suggest about gender, sexuality and our subjects? And as I say, this is an example from mathematics. but I wonder if you can find examples from your subject that are similarly controversial. I'll give you just a moment to look at that. Many questions about this. Please feel free to tweet them at me. And many assumptions and perhaps many connections there again between what it might mean to be a mathematician as represented here. So something I've found useful is a few different pieces of research that have talked about types of bias in educational materials. And one of these is the Myron Sadker 7 Forms of Bias in Educational Materials. So one of these is the invisibility idea. So when we're looking at textbooks, when we're looking at resources, and when we're looking at assessments, what you don't see is important. So who's not represented in materials? Who is completely non-existent? And that's really, really important. So one of the first stages when you're looking to do an audit of the resources that you're showing to students is who's not there. And as I said, quite often same-sex relationships just do not exist. Very important to consider. People of colour just do not exist. And so the very first thing, the baseline, is who is represented and who exists. Then we have this idea of stereotyping. And quite often we find some absolutely appalling examples of stereotypes in educational materials. I imagine you can find some examples. Some of them are because educational materials are older and because they need updating, and that's, you know, we don't have unlimited money in education, but equally we should be pointing them out and we should be making examples of them. Imbalance and selectivity. So quite often it's about what things are highlighted and what things are not. So this idea of a tale half told. So we might have women represented in our mathematics textbooks, but actually there's one or two. They're token women and the rest are all men and they're all white men. And this idea of unreality. So they found, again, this was through a survey of textbooks, that there was a lot of rose-coloured glasses going on. So that the idea that actually it was not reality as was currently reflected, but actually reality as a kind of idealised version. So we still had women from the 1950s who did cookery and, you know, domestic things and then made dinner for their husbands who came home from their jobs. You know, this is not the real world anymore. And it's very, very important that we move forward and we reflect reality as it is now. The idea of fragmentation and isolation. So the fact that the parts may be less than the whole. We have to think holistically when we're representing things. We have to actually do a whole tally and do the parts add up when we're considering resources. What's the student seeing? The student's not just seeing that one resource. What's the student seeing day after day after day after day? Then we have the linguistic bias ideas. So the words that you use really matter. If we think about the words that we use, they're very clearly gender biased. And so when we're writing questions, when we're thinking about textbooks and assessments, we definitely have a tendency to use specific words. We have to very carefully think about the way that we might use that word, those words, and correct. And the same thing in the classroom as well, drawing attention to the way that words might be used and really highlighting to pupils how to be critical. And then the idea of cosmetic bias. So shiny covers. So I've shown you this picture here from the University of Adelaide, who I imagine were trying to do a good job of showcasing their mathematics course, because they had thought, I think, a little bit about representation. They were trying to get a representation of perhaps different ethnicities and different genders, but what they've actually done there is they've got a man explaining mathematics to a lot of women who, I don't know if they were told to look a little baffled, not really sure, but they do look slightly baffled. So all of these subtleties and these nuances really, really matter. So some things we can do, and as I said, these come from the LGBTQ plus community. I specifically asked them, and these are really taken from all of the answers that they gave me that I have collected together and synthesised. So the things that we can do to make this better for our pupils. Certainly not making assumptions about gender or partner's gender. And this is to do with parents, but also older pupils. And we can also use they and their until you're told. And when I say this to people, they say, oh, that's too difficult, I can't do that. Almost any TV show you watch where you have things like Star Baker, they use these linguistic devices all the time. They say things like, oh, the Star Baker this week was really, really good at using different coloured icing. They are amazing at. You are very, very proficient at doing this. I promise you, you just need to make sure you flip that switch in your brain. Specifically ask about pronouns and display your own pronouns. So pronouns are he or she or they, him and her, and it's really useful to put your pronouns in your email signature, especially if you're heteronormative, especially if you're cisgendered. It just signals to people that we can't assume or know somebody's gender by looking at them or by looking at their name. It's really important to highlight those assumptions for everybody. Display signs and symbols and text showing support, really specifically saying, I support LGBTQ community, I'm an ally, I'm queer if you are, highlighting role models. It's really important to explicitly do that, in particular in your subject. Understanding that not everybody's ready to be out, maybe doesn't feel proud, that's important too. The goal here is certainly not to have everybody out. It's really important, and definitely not outing anybody before they're ready or without their consent. Not making unwarranted links between certain sexualities and particular behaviour or characteristics. So this is something you see in people who perhaps are a little older or who aren't very well versed in different types of identity. You know, you don't seem, people say this to me a lot, you know, you don't seem like you might be queer, you don't look gay. And it's really, really important to start challenging your own assumptions and beliefs here. Is that a helpful thing to say? Is that about your own comfort levels rather than the person in front of you? Is it useful? Maybe not. Checking your language and considering whether it's gendered. In the BBC show that Graham was part of, he found that he was saying things like sweetheart to girls all the time and not to the boys, and he was shocked at how often he did it. And there's something there about the language that we use. As I said, I'm raising children at the moment, and one of my children is absolutely infuriated the extent at which they get called good girl. And you would be surprised how often it happens. And not only do they not like being called a girl, but it's the kind of underlying assumption of compliance, that they are there to be compliant, and the boys in their class are not. They get rewarded for being adventurous and risky and bold and sometimes intellectual, and it's infuriating to them, and it's infuriating to me too. Calling out negative stereotyping, discrimination and anti-LGBTQ language. This is absolutely crucial. If you're hearing these phrases, these words being used, they need to be called out. We need to say this is unacceptable, we don't use those words, we don't use those phrases, and explain why. It's not just forbidden fruit that then the children are whispering. We are explaining what that language does, historically how it's been used and why, and really opening up that debate. It's really important. And then finally, as we talked about, understanding the community is diverse. As somebody who's queer, I don't speak for all queer people. I certainly don't have experience that erases other people's experience. We really need to explore the diversity experience within the community as well as just seeing it as an example of diversity. So I would be absolutely delighted to hear your questions, your reflections and your feedback. You can email me. You can also tweet me, as I said, on @honeypiesquared. I would love to hear your thoughts on the book as well. If you've read it or if you're going to read it, please do. And also there's a picture of my cat, Egbert. And thank you so much for listening today. It's been an absolute pleasure. Absolutely loved having you. And once again, thank you and goodbye.